Hey everybody, it's Emily at ARG Schooling, and today I want to talk about childhood nostalgic favorite books. I've been contemplating doing this video for a while, but I just never really fully sat down and thought about it until the other day. I kind of made a list. So I thought it would be fun to think back on my life as a reader. So I always say that I was born a reader. I've been reading since I can remember. My mom says I used to scream myself to sleep until I learned to read when I was around 3.5 or 4 or so, and then I would read myself to sleep. And I think that's funny because I still need to read myself to sleep. I can't fall asleep at night if I don't read because I'll just lay there and thinking. So reading helps me wind down at night. So that is a thing I've done my whole life, but I've always been a reader. But always loved books. And I want to talk about the ones that have been standouts for me growing up. One of the first books I can vividly remember loving and rereading a lot was Heidi by Joanna Spyri. And this is my original copy. It's one of the few books I have managed to hang on to from my childhood. My father was a teacher and he would often take my books to put in his classroom, so I didn't really get to hold on to a lot of my childhood books, which has been a thing that has bothered me my whole life. But this is one of the ones that I managed to keep. This was the prettiest book I owned as a child. This edition of Heidi was from the Duperron family. They were family friends with us. I think they lived a block away or something, and we used to interact a lot. But they gifted this to me when I was small. I don't know how old I was when I got this. I would guess 8 or 9, based on when we moved out of that house. I think I was probably around 8 or 9. And I think I read this every other month or so for a good 3 years when I was a kid. I loved Heidi so much. This is a story about a little girl who lives in the mountains, and she lives with this gruff old grandfather who does not know what to do with a small girl, and she goes to help herd the goats and eat cheese and bread, and it just, something about her life just spoke to me. I used to dream of living in Switzerland and going to the mountains and eating toasted bread and cheese and drinking goat's milk. It's just so cozy. So I read this so much when I was a kid. I just loved it, and I'm so happy that I still have this beautiful copy. And it's illustrated, and it smells lovely. Then another book that I vividly remember reading as a small child was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This one, I think it's funny because everyone talks about this being a Christian allegory, and I, a little Jewish girl, didn't get any of that. I didn't even know about that until I was an adult. But what I loved about this was probably one of the first fantasy stories I remember reading. And I vividly remember because my grandmother had a wardrobe in her room that I was obsessed with, because I was sure if I tried at just the right time, it would become a portal to Narnia. And I used to check it every time we visited, multiple times, because maybe it was the wrong time of day. And I think this is where my love of portal fiction comes from, because I loved the concept of a portal opening for me. And I would just stumble into this magical world and be a hero and save the day. And I just thought that was such a neat idea. But it took me years to even know what portal fiction was. Back when I was a child, we didn't have things like Goodreads and BookTube and all that. If you wanted to know about books, you just stumbled upon things. Maybe a teacher pointed something out to you. Maybe a librarian helped you out. Maybe you just stumbled on it. I would find things frequently just wandering around the library. But I didn't even know this was a series until I was an adult. I had no idea that there was more books in the series. I thought it was just a standalone. So I remember when I was in the 4th grade, I think, I had a teacher, Mrs. Jones. And Mrs. Jones would read aloud to us. And I don't know that I can think of another teacher that ever did this, but she would read stories to us. And she read us, I remember, Tales of a 4th Grade Nothing and the BFG. And why I remember this so vividly is because she did the voices and things. She made those books come to life. Like, she was such a good reader, and I think that's where I get it from. Like, when I read aloud, I'm always in my head trying to be Mrs. Jones. She was so good at reading stories and at captivating us. And like, she read us Tales of the 4th Grade Nothing. And I became obsessed with that book. I got myself a copy. I think I convinced my father to let me get it at a Scholastic book fair. And I read that book over and over again. It was never quite as good as having Mrs. Jones read it to me, but it was still pretty good. And same with the BFG. Like, I don't know that I ever owned it, but that is how I discovered Roald Dahl and read some of his other books. But those 2 books I do remember, and I hear them in my head in her voice still. Like, she was so good at reading aloud. I have no idea what happened to Mrs. Jones, but she was a huge influence on me as a child. I remember loving Little Women. Little Women is probably the first piece of classic literature that I consumed and devoured. To me, it was a way to find a family where I had sisters. I grew up desperately wanting a sister. I had a little brother that I didn't get along with, and he annoyed me, and I just thought if I'd had a sister instead, it would have been better. So I remember just loving Little Women because it was a way for me to vicariously have sisters and feel what that was like, and to have parents who were still married and loved each other. And I don't know, something about the March family really spoke to me. I still want to be one of the March sisters. I really related to Laurie in that way, and that he just wanted desperately to be a part of this family, and he'd marry any one of those sisters if it made him a March. So I felt that. And then that was also around the same time I discovered Anne of Green Gables. And I loved Anne. I still love Anne. I remember I read the book after having watched the TV series. I grew up watching the Megan Follows Anne of Green Gables, which is, to me, the only acceptable version of the Anne of Green Gables adaptations. I've seen a few of the other ones, and they do not work for me. Megan Follows is Anne. And I'd seen that first and found out that it was a book and found it at the library. And I loved her so much. And I've only read the first 4, I think, books. I've always meant to continue them, but I never have. I own all of them now. I collected them as an adult. I only owned the first 3 growing up. And I think I read the 4th one that I found at the library. And I had not continued after that. And maybe that's something I should do someday, is to see what happens next. But I loved reading about her growing up in Avonlea and finding a place where she belonged. And I, to this day, would love to go to Prince Edward Island. I feel like I'm supposed to be there. Every time I've ever read Anne, I feel like I'm there. I feel like I know that place. And that is a bucket list thing for me. I want to go to Prince Edward Island so bad, because that's where my bosom friend, Anne Shirley, lives. And those books, let me just tell you, I'm a rereader. I'm still a rereader. I hear people say all the time that they'd never reread any books, and that could never be me, because I would reread a book until it fell apart. I must have read Little Women on repeat. I would literally finish it and immediately start it back over again because I didn't want to leave yet. And so I would reread the same book over and over and over. I had passages memorized, and I would just live in that book for as long as I could. Speaking of books that I reread until they fell apart, 6th Grade Secrets by Louise Sachar. I have talked about this book before, and people went out and read it. And assume that because I loved a book as a child that it was great literature. I don't know that I would call this that, but this was a book that I was obsessed with. Like, I made my friends read it. I loved this book, and I was probably around 10 or so when I read it. Maybe 11, somewhere in there, because this was one of the last things I remember reading that was for kids. This was a story about a girl who starts a secret club at school. Like, clubs are banned at their school because one kid felt left out and his parents complained, so they're not allowed to have clubs anymore. But she starts a secret club called Pig City based on like a baseball hat that she buys at a garage sale or something. The story is all about these two like competing secret clubs that are like in this feud. And it's all based on a misunderstanding between her and the boy that likes her. Something about this book just like crawled into my brain and would not leave. I read this so many times that my book literally fell apart. I don't know why. I cannot explain to you why this book was for me, why I just thought the idea of the secret clubs was really great. I loved this weird feud over a misunderstanding, and I just like, this time he's gonna explain, and then they won't have the feud. They'll just be in love. This was the first thing I think I ever read that was like the closest I can come up to like a romance. Like, yes, there's some romance in Little Women and in Anne of Green Gables, but that's not what the story's about, you know? This was the first book I can remember. And I don't even like romance for the romance, but I love a story with romance in it. Does that make sense? I don't know. But this was the first book where like I connected to that. And I was obsessed with it. Let me see. I think the last book I had as a child, like before I got to my tweens, that I read was The Hobbit. My mother is a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and she encouraged me to try reading Lord of the Rings. I could not get into Lord of the Rings. I didn't read that until I was an adult, but growing up, I read The Hobbit cover to cover so many times. I loved it. That was my way into Middle Earth, and that's probably the only like fantasy story besides Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe that I ever read growing up. I didn't even know that fantasy was a thing outside of like The Hobbit. That was the closest I'd been to reading fantasy. And I have no idea why. It just that's the one that I picked up. And because I was such a rereader, I would like just have the same like 5 or 6 books that I would just rotate myself through. It was rare for me to pick up something new. And then, right around the time I turned 12, I discovered historical fiction via the Holocaust. I read The Devil's Arithmetic, and that changed my brain chemistry in a way that I cannot explain. I read that book right around the time I learned about, like, I don't want to say learned about I'd known about the Holocaust as long as I can remember, but I didn't really learn about it, like deep dive into it until I was around 12. I vividly remember me and a boy I was friends with at Temple, at the synagogue, wandering into the synagogue library and going over to the Holocaust section and like picking a book up. And I don't know, something in that moment, I got lost in that time and became fully obsessed. I'm going to call it the tism. I think my autism clicked in that moment and I hyperfixated for the rest of my life, essentially. I can't say that I've never stopped hyperfixating on that, but that was when it started. And I devoured The Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen. Like, I think I read that whole book in a sitting and immediately started it over. And I read that book over and over and over. That's also around the same time I started reading Anne Frank's diary. And those two books were what I would say, like, got me into that as my new obsession. And I just, after that, I just would read anything and everything. I watched a ton of movies. Like, when I was a kid, the adults around us would just, like, talk about things. And I vividly remember we were visiting a family that my father was friends with, and they were watching a movie or a documentary or something about Sobibor, a concentration camp. And I was probably 10-ish, and it was really graphically upsetting, like what they had on the TV in that room. And I was just like, I couldn't stop staring at the TV. I had never seen anything quite like that, which is ridiculous because I grew up watching a lot of horror movies with my dad, but there's something very vastly different about watching like a slasher movie and watching something about the Holocaust. Like, I don't know. But that's around the time when my Holocaust hyperfixation began. So yeah, Anne Frank became one of my best friends. Like, I read her diary to tatters, and I just felt like I knew her as a person. Like, we were friends. Like, I had met her. Like, that's how I felt about it when I was reading that. And to be honest, like, that's how I felt about a lot of the books that I read as a kid. Like, these were people that I knew. Like, did I know it was fiction or that these people were no longer alive? Sure, but like, while I was in the story, I was there. We were friends. We were hanging out. We were talking to each other. We were communicating, you know? Because that's what reading did for me when I was a child. And I think right around the time that I became obsessed with the Holocaust, okay, I'm no longer a child. I'm not reading books for kids anymore. Let's go into the adult section of the library. And like, my gateway to that was Christopher Pike. I'm gonna say Remember Me by Christopher Pike was like the one that like I vividly remember well enough to like I could tell you the plot of that book. But I read anything I could get my hands on at the library, and they had quite a lot. And I read a lot of Christopher Pike books. He was, I think, the closest you could get to YA back in the late 80s, early 90s. And I loved horror. I grew up as a small child, sneaking downstairs at night and watching horror movies with my dad, and traumatized the crap out of me, but I loved it. And so I remember reading Christopher Pike and just being like, wow, yeah, this is the thing for me. And I read John Saul around the same time, maybe a little bit younger. I might have been reading John Saul when I was slightly younger than that, because I do remember I had to do a project for school once, and we'd have like make a game or something based on a book that we'd read, and I did mine on Comes the Blind Fury by John Saul, and I think I was in like the 4th or 5th grade, and I vividly remember going up to my teacher, handing my project in and saying, I don't read books for children. This is an adult book that I read. And like being just the pretentious little brat that I was. But I read John Saul and Christopher Pike, and they were my gateway to Stephen King. I remember my mother was reading Stephen King, and she had a few of his books on her shelf. And I think, and I'm not even 100% sure anymore, I think my first Stephen King was Carrie. And I, from there, read, I think I read It, because big books did not scare me the slightest when I was small. I would read anything. So I read It and The Shining. I think those were the 3 that I vividly remember reading as a kid. And that was just everything I read. I read so much Stephen King and John Saul growing up. Like, those were my go-to authors. I think that was around the same time, too, that I found a copy of The Exorcist at a yard sale. And I brought it to school. I think I was in either the 7th or the 8th grade. Might have been 8th grade. And I brought the copy of The Exorcist to school and got in trouble because one of my teachers decided it was satanic and that I couldn't have that on school property and tried to get me in trouble. And like, you guys, my parents didn't care what I was reading. Like, I had books that were available to me that probably most parents would have been like, what are you letting your child read? I don't know. I don't think back in the 90s, most parents really cared. They were just happy their kids were reading, I think. So like I had that copy of The Exorcist and I would bring it to school and me and my friends would like look up the worst passages and then read them to each other. That was a thing I remember doing. That was like a fun little tour through the books that I remember as a kid that made me a reader. I don't know, this was very rambly. I did not come here with a plan. I just wanted to ramble and talk about books that would bring back memories of my weird little childhood. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know down below in the comments, what are the books that made you a reader? And when did you become a reader? I would love to hear about it. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Happy reading. Bye.